set sail to avenge China's attack on Japan. It's so severe that if China doesn't back down, Japan could lose 2.6 trillion yen in a single year. You probably never heard of it because not even a single bullet was fired. Yet the damage it could unleash is enough to cripple Japan. On January 6, 2026, China announced intense restrictions on selling rare earths to Japanese companies. It's kind of crude oil, but for modern technology. Your phones, laptops, defense systems, and almost every tech you could think of is just a showpiece without rare earths. The only problem with them is the mafia that controls them. And the moment you take a stand against their bullying, they'll make you suffer. The moment arrived when Japan's Iron Lady set China on fire with one sentence. She said if China attacks Taiwan, it could be considered an existential crisis for Japan, and they might have to intervene. It pissed off China so much that a Chinese official shamelessly mentioned cutting her head off. But the real damage came with the deja vu surgical strike. On the 6th of January, China announced its first restrictions on rare earths. But 3 days later, Beijing suspended every single export license for heavy rare earths and magnets going to Japanese firms. That was an economic blockade. And why not? It is blinded by the superpower that hides behind a fake name, rare earth elements. China controls roughly 70% of the world's rare earth production and over 90% of the refining capacity. So when they turn off the tap, there's almost nowhere else to go. Japan is the world's largest importer of rare earths. When China started slowing down licenses in January, it immediately broke the just-in-time supply chains Japanese manufacturing runs on. And China was supplying 80% of Japan's rare earths and a third of their magnets when it started. But why did I just say rare earths is a fake name? Well, look at this metal. It's a rare earth element called cerium. You might think that they are extremely rare and only found in special places. But cerium is actually twice as abundant as copper in the Earth's crust. In fact, even the rarest of the rare earths, thulium, is still 5 to 6 times more common than gold. So, in theory, these elements aren't that rare at all. But if that's the case, why is the world dangerously dependent on China? After all the bullying and the blackmail, they could have simply discovered their rare earths and cut off the dependency. That all sounds great, in theory. But in practice, they still depend on the superpower that China has. That superpower comes into play after a rare earth discovery is made. So, even if a country discovers rare earth reserves, which itself is very difficult in the first place, the later stages make them dependent on China. Getting them out is absolute hell in the first place. They almost never concentrate in one spot. Usually less than 5% of the ore is actually useful. They're often mixed with radioactive stuff like thorium and uranium. Separating them requires over 100 different processing steps because chemically, they're almost identical to each other. Chinese Bayan Obo mine, for example, grinds through low-grade ore with more than 100 separation cycles just to get usable material. The overall process is brutal on energy, generates mountains of toxic waste, and costs a fortune. So almost nobody wants to build the facilities to do the job. Most countries either lack the technology or are constrained by environmental concerns. Europe, for example, avoids it because of environmental damage. But China has a lethal combination of both. It blinded China into the delusion that it could bully anyone and escape retaliation, just like they did in 2010. On September 7, 2010, a Chinese fishing boat rammed into a Japanese Coast Guard vessel near the Senkaku Islands. You might have heard this name before. These are the same tiny disputed islands in the East China Sea that both countries have been fighting over for decades. So Japan arrested the captain. Pretty standard stuff, nothing crazy. But China responds with an absurdly aggressive move. They just stopped shipping rare earths to Japan. No official announcement, no formal embargo, just quietly turned off the supply. While China publicly denied any embargo was happening, the data tells a different story. Customs records show China slashed their overall rare earth export quotas from about 65,000 tons in 2008 to around 30,000 tons in 2010. This was a massive 54% reduction. Japan didn't do anything wrong, yet it still regretted this decision because of the pathetic situation it was in back then. Back in 2010, Japan was in an even worse spot than today. They were importing 90% of their rare earths from China, especially the heavy ones needed for performance magnets in cars and electronics. Almost everything came from one source that could disappear overnight for political reasons. That ban silently started killing Japan. Prices exploded. Heavy rare earths spiked 400 to 600%, and in some cases shot up 10 times their original value within a single year. Japanese car companies struggled to procure materials for hybrid motors. Electronics factories were stuck. Production lines started shutting down. The entire industrial sector was paralyzed. The world realized how one country had weaponized control over critical materials. Japan somehow tackled it with a short-term solution. It teamed up with the EU and the US and took China to the World Trade Organization. 4 years later, in 2014, they won, and China had to drop their export quota system. Problem solved, right? No, not even close. Beijing just switched its tactics. Instead of quotas, they used tighter licensing and consolidated the entire rare earth industry under direct government control. But behind Japan's agitated face was a calm genius, the one who silently started working on a plan to dethrone China. Within a month of that 2010 crisis, Japan approved an emergency budget of 100 billion yen, dedicated entirely to breaking free from Chinese rare earths. That became a full-blown national security mission. The government set up a whole strategy through their Ministry of Economy, Trade, Industry, and JOGMEC. Over the next 15 years, they went all in on 4 main approaches: cutting down how much rare earth their products actually needed, finding alternative materials that do the same job, massively scaling up recycling to extract rare earths from old devices, and building entirely new supply sources outside of China. That game began with investing $250 million in 2011 into Lynas Rare Earths. This created an entirely separate supply route, from the Mount Weld mine in Australia to processing plants in Malaysia. It cut China out completely and became the largest non-Chinese rare earth source in the world. Japan also backed mining projects in Vietnam and Namibia, subsidized companies to redesign components to use less dysprosium and other scarce elements, and basically attacked the problem from every angle possible. But did all of that hassle even work? By 2024, Japan cut China's share from 90% down to around 60 to 63%. Still way too high, but a massive improvement from where they started. After 15 years and billions of dollars, Japan built backup suppliers, stockpiled reserves, and redesigned entire industries. But when China flipped the switch again in January of 2026, Japan somehow was still vulnerable enough for it to wreck their economy. Japan called the ban unacceptable, ran straight to the WTO, started emergency calls with the US, Australia, and India through their Quad alliance, desperately looking for alternative supplies. The same pattern repeated, Japan was bullied again. In November of 2025, Japan's new prime minister stood in front of parliament and declared that if China attacks Taiwan, it could be considered an existential crisis for Japan under their 2015 security laws. Those specific words carry serious legal weight. Calling something an existential crisis under Japanese law means Japan could activate collective self-defense. They could actually deploy their self-defense forces to help allies, potentially including Taiwan. For a country that's maintained a pacifist constitution since World War II, this was huge. Beijing saw this as a direct attack on their One China policy and demanded Takaichi take it back. But she refused. Things got ugly fast. The Chinese consul general in Osaka, Xu Zian, went on social media and posted something that crossed every diplomatic line. He wrote that the intruding, dirty neck must be cut off without hesitation. That was a direct threat. Tokyo immediately filed a formal protest, but Beijing wasn't backing down. Diplomats met, and Beijing kept demanding a full retraction. They were framing this as Japan trying to dominate Asia once again, feeding nationalist anger back at home. But while diplomats argued, China's Ministry of Commerce was preparing the real punishment. Throughout 2025, they'd been building a legal framework to weaponize rare earths, way more lethal than in 2010. In April of 2025, they dropped the first wave of export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements. And in October, they dropped the second wave, 8 new notifications that completely changed the game. These new rules didn't just control raw materials anymore, they covered processing equipment, technology, anything with potential military applications. The really clever thing was the affiliates rule. It says if a product contains even 0.1% of Chinese origin rare earth materials, or was made using Chinese technology, foreign companies would need Beijing's approval to export it, even if the final product is made in Australia or Vietnam. If Chinese rare earths or Chinese tech touched it in any point, China claims control. It means death by 1,000 cuts for Japan. Maximum economic pain, minimum international backlash, no clear evidence for a WTO complaint. China sent a message that if you even hint at defending Taiwan, we can cripple your economy without firing a shot. But Japan decided to do something insane. Crazy enough to make them independent for 700 years. On January 12, 2026, just days after China tightens the noose, a massive Japanese drilling vessel called Chikyu set sail for a weird island. They set sail towards Minami Torishima, one of the most remote islands in the Pacific. I call this weird because there are 1,181 miles from Tokyo, absolutely middle of nowhere. That island has no permanent residents or civilian population. So what makes this island crazy? It turns out the real treasure is not on the island, but in the waters surrounding the island. This was nothing less than Mission Impossible. Drill 6,000 meters into the ocean floor and pull up rare earth-rich mud. That's nearly 4 miles deep, deeper than Mount Fuji's height. The pressure down there is so extreme that it would almost crush anything built by humans. The craziest part is nobody has ever attempted continuous extraction at these depths before. It looked Unachievable, but impossible is exactly what the Japanese are known for overcoming. On February 2nd, 3 weeks later, they announced success. And the numbers are wild. That seabed deposit holds 16 million tons of rare earth oxides, which is the third largest on the planet. More importantly, it's loaded with heavy rare earths, the exact ones China just cut off. Enough dysprosium for a whopping 730 years. Enough yttrium for 780 years. The mud is basically millions of years of fish bones that soaked up rare earths from the ocean. Japanese scientists figured out how to concentrate it from 5,000 parts per million up to 22,000. In simple terms, they turned low-grade mud into something as rich as a mine. If they can scale to 350 tons a day by 2027, Japan could be completely self-sufficient. But they are also hedging their bets. Tokyo just dropped 39 billion yen to back mining projects in Vietnam and Australia. That's part of a $780 billion budget with nearly $4 billion for green tech and $242 million for recycling, a 60% jump from last year. Tech companies are moving fast too. Proterial just started mass-producing magnets that don't need dysprosium or terbium at all. Nissan cut recycling costs in half. The plan is to get 15 to 20% of Japan's needs just from recycling old devices and cars. The Australian Linus pipeline is maxed out. Vietnamese and Namibian projects are being pushed harder. Every non-Chinese source is running overtime. The only problem is that none of this saves Japan today. Deep-sea mining won't be commercially viable until 2027. Recycling covers maybe 20% max. Other suppliers can't just flip a switch and double production. Japan has got 6 months of stockpiles and long-term plans that will take years to pay off. Meanwhile, China's grip is still tight. Can Japan hold out long enough for these solutions to actually work? Or does Beijing's economic squeeze force them to cave on Taiwan first? According to Nomura Research Institute, if China keeps this going for just 3 months, Japan loses 660 billion yen in production, about $4.3 billion, and 0.1% gets shaved off of their GDP. Painful, yet survivable. A full year, though? 2.6 trillion yen gone, around $17 billion. That is 0.4% off of GDP. Some analysts are going even darker, warning real GDP could drop anywhere from 1.3% to 3.2% if this keeps dragging on. Japan is the world's largest importer of rare earths. China was supplying 80% of Japan's rare earths and a third of their magnets when this started. The car industry got hit first. Hybrids and EVs need 2 to 3 kilograms of neodymium magnets for their motors. No magnets means no production. In January of 2026, Honda paused production at several factories. Toyota slashed their global production targets. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles potentially affected. Suzuki just stopped building their Swift model entirely, citing rare earth shortages. And this is happening right when global EV demand is jumping 7.7%. Japanese automakers are losing ground to Chinese and Korean competitors who aren't even dealing with export bans. Commodity prices went insane. NdPr oxide, the key magnet material, shot up to nearly $100,000 per ton in January, a multi-year high. Chinese suppliers started playing games with tiered pricing and minimum order requirements. Small companies got squeezed out completely. Japan's used car export market, worth 1.5 trillion yen, saw prices plateau. New car delivery time stretched out because of production delays. So suddenly everyone wanted used hybrids and gas cars they could get immediately. Toyota Land Cruisers and Alfords flying off to Russia and Africa. Meanwhile, used EV values tanked because new non-rare earth batteries were getting cheaper. But while Japanese factories are going dark, there's a scramble happening in Washington. Japan's finance minister and the US Treasury Secretary called an emergency meeting. And it's not just them. The UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Australia, South Korea, India, Mexico, everyone shows up. All of them are talking about one thing: how to stop China from this madness. They are calling it prudent de-risking. What they really mean is we need to stop depending on China before they choke us out too. One idea floating around is creating a floor price for rare earths, basically making sure China can't just flood the market with cheap materials and bankrupt every competitor like they did after 2012. And this wasn't just a panic mode reaction. Back in October of 2025, before any of this blew up, Takaichi and Trump had already signed a massive framework agreement. Technically non-binding, but the implications are massive. They created the Critical Mineral Supply Security Rapid Response Group. It sounds like a bureaucratic mouthful, but it is basically the US and Japan saying, we're building our own rare earth system, and China, you're not invited. Joint funding for mines, shared stockpiles, and fast-tracking permits. Japan and the UK jumped in too with the Hiroshima Accord, working on magnet recycling tech and protecting supply chain data from cyber attacks. Everyone is building escape routes. But Beijing has been watching this, and they are pissed about it. From their perspective, it looks like the entire Western world is trying to box them in. They are calling it Encirclement, a zero-sum game designed to contain China's rise. Chinese officials are saying their export controls are totally justified. They're calling it a lawful response to Japan remilitarizing and joining up with American economic aggression. Chinese analysts are arguing that Japan only depended on China because Chinese rare earths were cheaper and better, and now Tokyo is crying victim over their own business decisions. But here's the move that shows how calculated Beijing is. It's late 2025. China temporarily eased some export controls after cutting a trade deal with the US in Malaysia. China proved it can tighten restrictions when it wants to, then ease them for specific partners as part of diplomatic or trade negotiations. That gives Beijing leverage in global supply chains and sends a clear message. Pressure can be applied selectively, and relief is negotiable. Analysts at CSIS are calling this textbook coercive diplomacy through critical minerals. Japan is walking a tightrope. They are publicly condemning the ban as absolutely unacceptable, filing formal protests. But quietly, Tokyo is being very careful not to confirm exactly how severe the rare earth cuts actually are. They don't want mass panic or to paint themselves into a corner where backing down becomes impossible. But surprisingly enough, even after all the chaos, Takaichi still retains her biggest superpower. Takaichi's hard stance on Taiwan hasn't hurt her polling numbers yet. Japanese voters seem fine with it. She has the firm backing of most Japanese citizens. But business lobbies, they're panicking, pressuring the government behind closed doors to find an exit that doesn't destroy corporate profits. Washington sees this as proof of concept. China is testing whether cutting off key resources can pressure a big economy into falling in line. If it works, other countries like South Korea or Australia could be next. That's why the US is rushing to invest in rare earth projects with allies and build emergency stockpiles. Europe, India, South Korea, countries that aren't even targets right now, they're all scrambling to build their own backup plans. Because if it can happen to Japan after 15 years of preparation, it can happen to anyone. In fact, this time the damage could be multifold. When Japan, the EU, and the US beat China at the WTO in 2014, it worked because China was using obvious export quotas. This time Beijing's wrapped everything in national security and dual-use controls. WTO rules get really weak around national security justifications, way easier for China to defend. There might be another WTO case, but the entire global trading system is already falling apart. Semiconductor wars, retaliatory tariffs flying everywhere, so one more case might not even matter. China just showed that they found an economic weapon that's almost impossible to counter through international law, and every Western government is realizing the institutions they thought would protect them might be useless. But the shockwaves from this aren't stopping at Japan's borders. The entire world is scrambling to reorganize how they get critical materials, and it's happening fast. In July of 2025, the Quad, that's Australia, India, Japan, and the US, launched something called the Quad Critical Minerals Initiative. They are trying to align technical standards, figure out which materials are actually critical, build a joint investment platform so they can fund mining projects together instead of competing against each other. India, for example, is trying to cut off dependency from China. In the February 2026 budget, New Delhi announced rare earths corridors across 4 states: Odisha, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. They are building integrated regional ecosystems for mining and processing, trying to become an alternative supplier outside Chinese control. Europe, on the other hand, has other plans. China's export controls on gallium, germanium, and rare earths pushed the EU to establish the European Critical Raw Materials Center in 2026. They are copying Japan's playbook, focusing on what they call nature-positive diversification, basically mining that accounts for environmental and social costs instead of just racing to the bottom on price. And this is starting to change global mining standards. The G7 is pushing life cycle assessment-based procurement, which sounds technical but basically means penalizing rare earths produced with massive environmental damage, high radioactive waste, and excessive water use, areas where Chinese production has been criticized for years. The numbers show why everyone's panicking, though. The global market for rare earth permanent magnets was worth over $13 billion in 2024. It's projected to hit $25 billion by 2030. Demand for NdPr oxide, the key magnet material, is growing at 7.7% per year. But there's a problem. Even if every non-Chinese refining project currently planned actually gets built and hits targets, by 2030 they will be producing maybe 30,000 tons of capacity. That sounds like a lot until you realize it's only 15 to 20% of projected global demand. China is going to control the majority of rare earth refining for the foreseeable future, even with everyone desperately trying to build alternatives. They've got too much of a head start, great expertise, and insane infrastructure already in place. This is what the new global order looks like, not defined by military alliances or ideological camps, but by who controls the materials that make everything work. And right now, China's still winning that game, even as everyone else races to catch up. 2024 data shows China produces 60 to 70% of global rare earth output and controls most processing. A 2025 report measured this using the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, a fancy way of measuring market concentration. China scored above 4,000. Anything over 2,500 is highly concentrated. Above 4,000, that's pure monopoly territory. Even if you mine rare earths somewhere else, Australia, the US, wherever, the ore still has to be processed. And that processing still happens mostly in China, and that is the real trap. The more China uses minerals as a weapon, the faster the world splits into what analysts are calling distinct mineral blocks. One centered on China, integrated with their refining and manufacturing, pulling in parts of Asia and African partners. The other, US, Japan, EU, Australia, India, are desperately building parallel supply chains at whatever cost. This fragmentation is already happening. Countries are willing to pay double, triple of the market price for rare earths just to guarantee the supply can't get politically cut off. There are three ways this could play out, and each one leads to a completely different world. The first path, Japan grinds through this and actually pulls it off. By 2030, they've cut Chinese dependency below 50% through sheer force of will. Vietnamese and Australian imports ramped up. Deep-sea mining delivering real results. Those dysprosium-free magnets everywhere. China would still be the biggest player, but they can't choke Japan out anymore. Second path, things go sideways fast. Military conflict over Taiwan erupts, or China just says, forget it, and cuts off rare earths completely. Japan and the West fire back by banning all advanced tech exports to China. The global economy doesn't just stumble, it crashes. Japan's GDP drops over 3%. Car production freezes worldwide for years. We're talking a major recession. But the third path is where it gets wild. Japan's deep-sea gamble actually works. By 2030, they're pulling rare earths from the ocean floor at commercial scale, refining that 16 million tons sitting at Minamitori. Japan doesn't just escape China's grip, they flip the entire game. Suddenly, they're a major supplier, selling heavy rare earths to the world. China's monopoly almost shatters. Japan goes from desperate buyer getting squeezed to sovereign producer calling their own shots. Which of these scenarios plays out is something only time will tell.
Canned tuna was invented in 1903 in the USA. The USA also invented spam, and the same USA also invented concept of fighting communists in the poor Asian countries. That's how Koreans fell in love with the canned meat. Koreans are very good at converting their sad history into something delicious. Talking about the canned meat, obviously in Korea the most famous one is spam, S-P-A-M, but the canned tuna they started to produce by themselves in the 1980s. So this one also enjoys huge popularity, probably selling more than spam. So today I will treat myself with the three most popular Korean canned tuna dishes, so stay tuned. First up, the canned tuna kimchi jjigae. Generously oil up the pan. Don't be shy to add up some tuna oil, onion in, kimchi, obviously. Saute about 2-3 minutes. Add some soy sauce for flavor. Saute another 2-3 minutes, then add a bit of gochugaru, mainly for the color. You can add some sugar if you want, add some stock, or just water. Once start boiling, add chopped garlic, season with the fish sauce and salt. Simmer about 10 minutes or so. Add tuna finally. Make sure put everything in the can. Blanch the tofu, it's optional. Sorry I missed to film blanching part. Just submerge the whole tofu in boiling water about a minute or so, that's it. And you continue to simmer 10 to 15 minutes. Finish up with some scallion, sesame, optionally sesame oil. It's done. Next up, the canned tuna pancake. Reserve some tuna oil for later. Tuna in. Here I used 2 cans of tuna because some will be for the next dish. Carrots in, red chili in, onion in, scallion in, everything finely chopped. Mixy, some salt,
Hi, mixy again, while adding some reserved tuna oil both for flavor and texture. Here I put 70% of my tuna mix for pancake and the other 30% I will use later for the rice. Add chopped garlic, egg, some pepper, just normal flour. Here I'm checking consistency and decide to add one more egg and more flour until I get wet paste-like texture and feel. Heat up some oil in the pan. Add spoonful of tuna mixture to the pan. The key to make a beautifully shaped pancake, not like here, is not to start YouTube channel, so you don't need to hold camera while cooking. Fry both sides until brown, done. Finally, tuna mayo rice. Add some sugar to remaining 30% of a previously reserved tuna mix, pepper, and mayonnaise. Mixy, tuna done. Simplified ponzu sauce, 2 parts soy sauce, 1 part mirin, lemon juice to taste, mix well. Pan on the medium heat, onion in, ponzu in, add some water, shimmer until the liquid is reduced to half. Brush sesame oil to the nori, salt, low heat on the pan, about 30 seconds to a minute, both sides. Okay, it's almost done. Egg in, why not one more? Salt, pepper, we make some mega simple scrambled egg. Okay, on the rice, egg first, nicely softened onion, tuna mayo mixture, crush nori with hands. If you want more beautifully crush it, don't start YouTube channel. Some sesame as usual, and even more mayo, why not? Okay, tuna overload set done.
Okay, so tuna explosion. 참치 김치찌개, tuna 김치찌개 with blanched tofu, tuna 동그랑땡, 참치 동그랑땡, or 참치전, pancake tuna. This is 참치 mayo 덮밥. Tuna mayonnaise 덮밥 means that the covered rice. So there's a lot of tuna in here, like 3 cans of tuna, so it's like 150, so 300 450 grams of tuna here. I'm not sure if I can survive this. Try. Yeah. Tuna kimchi is something I know. Yeah, always good. I'm most curious about this because I never tried this. Yeah. Let's see. This is super good. Yeah. I think the killer is the onion reduced in ponzu sauce. This is a real killer. Yeah, it gives a lot. And umami bomb, the nori, with the sesame oil, it adds a lot. Good. Okay. Now, 참치전 or 참치 동그랑땡. You know what? Like, to be honest, I was like super skeptical before recording this because number one, too many canned tuna, and also this one because I never had it before. When I looked at the recipe, I was like, oh, wow, it must be like some kind of a good joke. But man, all this said, everything has its own flavor, and it's really good. It's crazy. To celebrate that fact, soju. Everybody loves cold soju. Tofu. This is really, I don't know. Tuna overall, tuna explosion. Something started as a joke, but I would put this on the menu, like all 3 of them. Flavor-wise, I'm really surprised. This people talk about new technology all the time. AI will paint a picture, make music, and when the technology will like transmit the flavor. This one is like a very popular soju anju. Anju means like a side dish for alcohol. It's called dubu kimchi. It's a perfect anju for soju. So, yeah. Man, I'm super happy. Yeah. Cheers. So yeah, canned tuna, affordable,
easy to get everywhere. I don't know if everywhere in the world canned tuna is available, but if it is available, then I think quality and the flavor is more or less standard. When you go to country, it's more or less the same flavor, you know. And also, it keeps like forever if you have some money. Instead of spending everything on the soju, like me, buy canned tuna. So every time you're broke, at least you have a canned tuna at home. There's apocalypse, Third World War, atomic bomb explosion or something like this. Even more reason to buy 1,000 canned tuna. By the way, this video is not sponsored by any canned tuna company. Yeah, my channel is too small to spend all your money for canned tuna. I cannot imagine anything better than this as a survival food, which is nutritious, which is easy to make, and which is delicious. How amazing. You will thank me later. You don't need to thank me later. You can thank me now by like and subscribe. Yeah, I just started. I need some encouragement. So please, if you can, support my channel. It will be great. Thank you very much. See you in the next video. Bye bye.
very special property. If you shine enough UV light on it, it will emit laser light. And not only that, but you can change the color of the light with just the turn of a screw if you set things up properly, though I am getting ahead of
The Free Alliance of El Paso has now installed the region's first free Narcan vending machine inside the UTEP Student Union.
Lasers that can be made this way are called dye lasers, and Rhodamine 6G isn't unique in its lasing ability. There are many dyes that come in a wide range of tunable colors, making them very versatile. But Rhodamine is the easiest to get this to work with. We just need a source of UV light intense enough. Enter this pile of junk on my desk, which is actually a high-power UV laser. It might not look like much when it's off, but it's the most powerful laser I own, with the ability to put out 100 kilowatt pulses. Though it's so far into the UV that you can't see the beam, and neither can my camera. If I put a solution of dye in front of it though, suddenly the beam is visible. It can be made almost entirely from stuff you might have around the house, but it is also incredibly dangerous as it uses intense high voltages to operate. Combine a dye like Rhodamine and this type of laser and you've got a recipe for, theoretically, a nice and straightforward dye laser. So how does this fit into the meat laser dream? Well, I have a theory. You see, theoretically, any highly fluorescent chemical should be able to laze in a dye laser. But what if that chemical was actually a protein? Like, for example, green fluorescent protein. This is a protein where its function is really what's written on the tin. It's a protein, and when you shine a UV light on it, it glows green. What makes this different than Rhodamine is that you can change the color of the protein by just changing its sequence. Proteins are a long chain of specially ordered amino acids. Changing even a single one changes the shape and function of the protein, even if only a little bit. Because of this, you can get fluorescent proteins in literally every color, and some look just as bright as the laser dyes when you shine a light on them. And I maintain a huge collection of genetically engineered E. coli that can produce a wide range of these colors in an easy to grow and extract form. Let's not get into the details of why I maintain that collection. I'm a mad scientist, don't overthink it.
What's he doing? What's he crafting? I can craft stuff too, pal!
The other thing that's special about proteins is that if I want a different color, all I need is the code for the color I want. When a scientist finds or makes a new color of these sorts of proteins, they will often add them to online databases or publish the sequence of the protein so that other researchers can use them. I can now go onto a site like FPBase that collects this information and just grab the code for the color I want. Then, like I've shown in previous videos, I can use that code to generate a piece of DNA that will allow cells to produce that protein. Then I just order the DNA from a supplier, load it into something like E. coli bacteria, and then grow as much of the protein as I want. It's a pretty cool process, so I've put links below to videos on how all of that works. Now think about what this all implies if green fluorescent protein and the rest of these colorful proteins can laze. You would have a genetically programmable protein laser. And since it's almost as easy to modify animal cells to produce green fluorescent protein instead of E. coli, theoretically, you could build a meat laser. If the cells are engineered to survive the intense UV pulse and produce a high enough amount of protein, the living cells themselves could act as the lasing medium. And the thing is, there are papers to back this insanity up from groups that have actually done basically that. But those papers only ever did it on a micro scale. I want a full laser beam. But for that to work, we first need a functioning dye laser, and since that part alone took us between 6 months and 6 years, depending on how you're measuring, we figured it was probably best that we pause here and share the progress we've made and all the things we've learned about dye lasers. Then, with that working tool in hand, next time we can focus on growing and purifying fluorescent proteins in our new bioreactors, and be able to directly test them in an already working dye laser. If that works, then we can use our new meat incubator to grow and modify animal cells, and the meat laser will be most of the way done. So let's get to it and start building. We'll of course be starting with the garbage laser. The proper name for this is a TEA, or transversely excited air laser. All it is 2 straight metal rails and some capacitors. They're set up in such a way that when the capacitors discharge, all of their energy is forced to jump between the rails. This ionizes the gas, turning it all to plasma for just a moment. Before we get further, let's quickly review how all lasers work. The short version is that you have some medium, be it a crystal or a liquid or a gas, and you input a bunch of energy. This raises the electrons in these special materials up to a higher energy. Think of it like pulling the bar back on a mousetrap. The medium wants to release the energy, but it needs a little bit of a nudge to do so. That nudge comes from photons passing through the charged up medium. As they fly through, they make nearby electrons shed their energy and emit photons of the same wavelength and in the same direction as the incident photon. This creates a cascade as the newly made photons trigger more and more to be released until the medium has spent all of its energy. Normally you need what's called a laser cavity, where you put mirrors on either side of the lasing medium so that light can bounce back and forth through the length of it, stimulating more and more light to be released in the same direction and as the same color. But with TEA lasers, the medium is so unstable it causes all of the gas to shed its energy fairly efficiently even without mirrors. In the case of the TEA laser, the thing that's actually doing the lasing is the nitrogen atoms, which make up about 70% of the air. But these lasers aren't limited to just using nitrogen. Nitrogen gives a nice UV emission, but subbing it out for CO2, for example, makes for a very powerful infrared beam instead. Before we assemble ours, I should mention that there are a lot of other great videos already on YouTube about these lasers. StyroPyro, Les's Lab, and Plasma Channel all have excellent videos on the topic if you want to learn more about them. I've linked to those below, but there are many, many more. There's actually a couple different ways to build these lasers, but having tried them all and burned many hours assembling and disassembling various versions, what I'll show you is the most foolproof method that is still very efficient. We built a beautiful and intricately engineered version, only to find out that after hours of machining and days of tinkering that the lasers made from trash seem to work way better. It's not to say that they're the most efficient, but the ease of construction and getting them to actually work makes up for any losses in power. That said, while I'll show all the details for educational purposes, I wouldn't recommend anyone actually build one of these things. They are incredibly dangerous, the voltages are very lethal, they are extremely loud, and produce incredibly intense pulses of laser light. So again, this is for educational purposes. Please don't actually try this. Here is the circuit diagram of the laser. To get started, we need a metal base plate. Here we're using an aluminum plate, but a big sheet of aluminum foil works too. Then we lay on top of it an acetate transparency sheet to act as an insulator, leaving one edge of the bottom foil exposed slightly. Then we add 2 more pieces of foil on top arranged like so, leaving at least a 1-inch gap from the edge of the transparency film. This creates our pair of capacitors. To form our laser channel, we place 2 pieces of hex bar so that they form a long, thin channel between the 2 upper pieces of foil. The top 2 capacitors also need to be electrically connected together, but we also want to make it difficult for electricity to flow without jumping between the rails. So we add an inductor made of a short length of wire, which I coiled around a pencil 15 or 20 times, then bent into an arc and held down onto the foils with a few large nuts. I like to hot glue 2 long wooden or plastic sticks to one of the rails so that they can be easily adjusted without having to actually touch them and risk electrocution. Next, we need a power source. We'll be using a flyback transformer driven by a ZVS driver which we got on Amazon. This puts out about 40,000 volts, but it does so as pulses of DC electricity. To smooth those pulses out so that it's flatter DC, we added a capacitor between the positive and negative. We're using a homemade doorknob style capacitor that we made from a standard high voltage cap. It's got bolts on the ends and is potted in epoxy to help prevent sparking. We had it left over from the more elaborate form of laser that we tried to build. Now we connect the negative to the exposed bottom piece of foil and the positive to this foil here. The last thing we need is a spark gap between the bottom layer of foil and the top layer. This is our wildly over-engineered version. While we absolutely could have just used 2 bolts with some acorn nuts on them, originally we planned on using a pressurized spark gap. Spark gaps work because air has what's called a breakdown voltage, which is the amount of voltage required for electrons to just fly through the air without a wire. But that voltage is set by the pressure. Increasing the pressure increases the voltage needed for a spark to form. Since this spark gap also controls the firing rate of the whole laser, we can then control the firing rate and how much energy each pulse has by just raising or lowering the pressure. But that's it for assembly. Now again, I wouldn't actually recommend building one of these as they are super dangerous, but if you're going to, these are the dimensions of all of the different parts that we used. Now to make this actually work, you adjust the voltage and the rails until everything is aligned perfectly. This can take a while, but once you get a feel for it, you can build the complete setup and achieve lasing in only a few minutes. Sometimes it helps to run the rails over some 2000 grit sandpaper on a really flat surface to knock off any rough spots and make sure they're all super flat, smooth, and parallel. One of the things that makes this laser so dangerous is that it's a UV laser and so you can't see the beam, but the light is still there even if you can't see it. To help visualize it and know when things are lined up, I put a piece of paper in front of the laser channel, and when everything is aligned, there will suddenly be a bright, glowing spot every single pulse. But with our UV source done, we can finally make the dye laser. In theory, dye lasers are simple setups. You've got a UV light source, a lens to focus the light down into a thin beam, a container for the dye, and a pair of mirrors. One fully silvered, and one partially silvered so that some light can still escape. But here's where we hit a snag. This is one of those topics where you really need to know the right words to be searching for to get good information, but unless you already know about these sorts of lasers, you probably won't know the right words. For example, it's very hard to find good information about which dyes will laze easily, the amount of light required to make them fire, and the correct concentration of dye. After weeks of messing with it, we realized that we needed to start stripping back some variables to figure out what is and isn't working. So we 3D printed a much more adjustable mount for all the different components and bought a commercial nitrogen laser. It works basically the same way as the TA laser we built, but it has a much more refined electrical system and, importantly, is in a nice, safe-to-be-around box. Also, it's computer controlled, so I can set the firing rate and even the amount of energy in each pulse. This makes it much safer and easier to work around, especially in the dark. And since it literally has "used for dye lasers" written in the manual, it removes the light source as the reason the dyes weren't firing. But if we wanted, now that we have things working, we could go back to the garbage laser. It's just loud and terrifying to be around, so we're going to stick with this one for now. The other snag was our choice of liquid container. When we started this, we were using these cheap polystyrene cuvettes, which you can get by the box, and in theory they seemed perfect. 4 clear sides, UV goes right through it, should be great. But what we didn't notice was that if you look down into the cuvette, there's these slight fillets in the corner. In this style of laser, the lasing happens in only about a millimeter or less of liquid right at the surface closest to the wall of the cuvette, which means that those fillets are directly in line with the laser light and will act like little prisms. So instead of a nice beam of laser light, you get a barely visible glow. Instead of amplification, all that light is being shot into the void, ruining the effect. When we finally caught on to that, we redesigned everything to use these homemade cuvettes made from microscope slides that we superglued together with the help of some 3D printed jigs. And while this worked relatively well, we eventually bit the bullet and bought some nice quartz cuvettes that are made specifically for this, which honestly we should have just done at the start. For the mirrors, we actually made our own using our magnetron metal coating machine, but they just as easily can be bought online. Just look for first surface mirrors and 90-10 plate beam splitters, the latter being a partially silvered mirror that will let about 10% of the light through. Sites like Thorlabs carry all this kind of stuff for fairly cheap. The mirror mounts I got on eBay for about $50 a piece, and they will allow the mirrors to be carefully adjusted in all 3 directions. As I mentioned before, the base to mount everything on was printed on our Prusa 3D printers, and there's a link below to all the 3D files we used in this project for anyone who happens to be following along. To focus the UV light into a tight beam, I bought a 25mm focal length quartz lens from Thorlabs. This has a spot in the 3D printed mount and even has a little adjustment arm to allow it to be carefully positioned to maximize how tight the beam is. To get this setup working, I highly recommend starting with rhodamine 6G. Saying it's the easiest to get to laze is an understatement. Just watch this. Even with no mirrors and just the lens to focus the UV light into the beam, if I hold the cuvette in my hand and move it into the focal point, laser beams come flying out the sides. Those beams are incredibly useful when trying to align the mirrors initially. Without them, you're basically aiming blind, and many dyes just won't laze properly unless everything's lined up. Once things are trimmed in, other dyes can be used, as they often just need that mirror to amplify enough light in order to laze. This is why I can't start with the fluorescent proteins. One thing you may have noticed is that at the beginning I mentioned you could change the color of the laser. There are 2 ways to do that. The first is, of course, just changing what dye you're using. Another really good dye is 7-diethylamino 4-methylcoumarin, which makes a lovely blue laser, though there are dozens of others to choose from. A fun quirk is that most of the chemicals used in highlighters that are fluorescent work really well in a system that's already trimmed in. Here, for example, we have fluorescein, which is a green-yellow color. And here is rhodamine B, which you may recognize from pink highlighters and is very similar to rhodamine 6G. And to save you a headache, here are all the concentrations that actually work, though a note, all of these must be dissolved in 99% ethanol to work properly. The other option for tuning the output color is to select the specific wavelength you want from each of these dyes. All of them actually have a range of wavelengths they're capable of emitting. When you use a normal mirror, the light emitted will just be a mix of all the different colors that the dye can emit. But if you replace the back mirror with a diffraction grating, things get a little more interesting. A diffraction grating splits light based on color. It's kind of like a sheet made out of prisms. When light hits it, different wavelengths will bounce off at different angles. So by having the grating here, depending on its angle, you can make specific colors be the only thing that is reflected back into the laser cavity. This will massively amplify that wavelength, so the beam coming out of the setup is confined to that color. By gently turning the screw on the mirror mount, you can move through the color range of the dye. I've got to say, it was incredibly satisfying to see this finally work, and getting that nice color swing from the various dyes was amazing. Most of the lasers we're used to seeing are diode lasers, and those are limited to specific colors because of how they're made. That's why you usually only see the same small handful of colors. But with this, with the right dye, you can have whatever color you want or need for your experiment. Now imagine what will happen when we try the fluorescent proteins. If they laze, they often have a huge range of their emission spectrum. So with only a small number of proteins, you can make a laser whatever color you want, and when the dye is spent, as it's damaged by the UV light, you can just grow more. And of course, if they laze, we are tantalizingly close to a full meat laser. We're already actively working on genetically modifying mouse cells for another project that you're going to see soon, so we may even have some GFP-expressing cells ready shortly once we dial in that protocol. If that all sounds exciting, then of course be sure to subscribe, as there is lots more where this project came from. And of course, if you'd like to help us make more videos like this, patrons, channel members, and supporters on Ko-fi are a huge reason we can do projects like this, so a big thank you to them as always. And if you'd like to see these videos before everyone else, or hang out on our exclusive supporter Discord, there's some links below. Before I wrap up, I leave you with this important question. Have you ever wanted to meet the amazing creators you watch on YouTube, or see the projects we all build in person? Well, I've got some good news. This July, from the 15th to the 16th in San Francisco, California, you can do just that at OpenSauce 2023. I'll be there along with some of the best creators on the platform, and I, for one, am so excited. Get your tickets now at the link below, and I hope to see many of you there. There will be exhibits, talks, panels, and sessions with many of your favorite creators, as well as a huge exhibition space filled with demos and displays. Creators are flying in from literally all over the world, so it's going to be a great event. For more info, see the links below. But with that, we've reached the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.